Welcome to the NOSA Unleashed podcast, where we want to expose and remove the stigma surrounding mental health by discussing real-life challenges and obstacles that keep us paralyzed and fearful to move forward. Let us inspire you to believe there is more to life than what you are currently experiencing. Now is the time to end the silence and pursue the path to purpose and fulfillment. We will do this together because no one stands alone. Welcome back to the NOSA Unleashed podcast. I'm Laura Burgoyne, joined here with my sister Connie Blackwood. And this month we want to focus on identity. And, when I think about identity, I actually have a ton of questions that come to mind. And, I just want to bring up a couple of them here to start. And the first question is, who are you? Right? Like, just take a minute and ask yourself that question. Who am I? And what are some of the thoughts that pop up in your mind? And, you might find that some thoughts come up regarding, you know, things that people have said to you, right? Maybe things that people have told you that you are, you know. And another question that comes to mind is, what defines you, right? Is it your work? Is it the things that you do? Is it the things that you've done in your past? Like, there's so many things that define and influence our identity. And so that's what Connie and I are going to be talking about today. And so, Connie, welcome to the conversation.
Glad that you have me here. And it's an interesting topic in the fact that all of us have an identity, and whether or not it's grounded in the correct place has a huge part to play. And I'm glad that we're talking about this today.
Yeah, because lots of things, impact how we view our identity.
Mm-hmm.
A few that come to mind is like our culture, not just like the culture in which we were raised in, but also like the culture that we live in, right? Like, the generations that we live in. It was funny, even last night, my nephew was in the kitchen and he's talking, and he started talking about, the generation before him. And he started speaking off just generalizations and stereotypes about that generation. And he's like, I'm glad I'm not from that generation. And, I was listening to him saying these things, but it's so true. Like, sometimes we even define ourselves by, that culture that we're growing up in. Well, this is just the way that we define ourselves, right? And as we look back, even in history, you know, the way we defined ourselves, the way we identified ourselves is so different 50 years ago than it is even today,
Mm-hmm.
right? So culture plays a huge role in how we choose to identify ourselves. Another thing, and this was huge for me, was our upbringing. What was our home life like? What was the environment? What were some of the things that were spoken to us, over us? You know, um, what was the prevailing messaging in our home? Like, did we have to perform in order to be loved? Like, there's just so many things.
Yeah.
Connie, is there anything that comes to mind when you think of what forms identity in us?
I think for me, a lot of it had to do with my peers too, like the people that I wanted to hang out with. That's, trying to define myself by what they accept, like they found acceptable, right? And trying to fit in. I think that's a huge piece, trying to figure out where we fit into this world. And especially
Mhm.
if we feel like we've been rejected by certain people or groups of people, then we try to figure out where do we fit? Where can I be? Where won't I be rejected? Or where can I mold myself that they don't know me yet, that I might be able to fit in? And so I think a lot of times, in order to keep relationships, we end up, shifting who we are in order to fit in order to find a place of belonging. And that is part of who we are, right? Whether or not we keep those pieces or let them go or shift ourselves, that's part of how we identify ourselves all of a sudden.
And I think we also have to consider the fact that we have like this enemy, right? You know, many people that might be listening to this, you might not believe in, faith. You might not believe that God exists. But I have come to know the reality that good and evil exists. God exists. And if God exists, that means there's also an opposing spiritual force. And the one thing that I've realized in my life is, and in my faith, we call him Satan or the devil or whatever. But his goal is to steal, kill, and destroy. And I believe he comes to steal, kill, and destroy our identity, right?
Mhm.
And why is that? It's because I believe that if he can rob us of our identity and a sense of knowing who we truly are, then we don't step into purpose,
Mhm.
right? And so he is hell bent and has a goal of, distorting identity,
Mhm.
stealing identity from us. And I feel like that's why there's so many things pulling at us, so many things that are, rob us of identity or shape our identity in ways that are false, in ways that are
Mhm.
not true. But it's almost like, we don't know what the truth is, and so we're just grasping, like, we're trying to find something that defines who I am. We're trying to find something that fits, something that feels right, and oftentimes we settle for things that aren't
Mhm.
true to ourselves. We don't step into purpose. We don't step into, who we truly are because, we're just, looking at the outside influences and not looking inward, right? And
Mhm.
it's a tough place to be. I know for most of my younger years, that was my biggest struggle was with identity. And, our home life wasn't great. Um, we've talked about that many times. And I had a different experience than you, Connie, in our home, but I felt like I didn't belong. I felt like somehow I must have been switched at birth. I felt like there was nothing that um, identified me as part of that family. And I felt rejected within our own family. And then I went to school and was rejected there. And I had so many messages played out in my life that I was no good, that I would never amount to anything, that my life had no purpose. I had people say that they hated me, they wished that I had never been born. And these were the messages that were constantly playing out in my life. And I remember as a youth being so anxious and depressed and suicidal, feeling like my life had no purpose. I had no sense of identity. And the only sense of identity I had was that I was a terrible person, was that there was nothing worth value in me, and there was no reason for me to keep going on in my life, right? And this is why identity is so important. If we live in a false identity for too long, it causes so much damage in our
Mhm.
lives.
And it's easier to believe the negative things that are said about us than the positive things. Because I'm sure there were positive things said to you during that time, but the things that cling to you were those negative things that were being said every day to you by your peers or whoever. And it just stuck, right? And, you know, one thing that comes to mind for me is if we live in a false identity for too long, what happens when that gets stripped away? So, like, for instance, if you're trying to fit in with your peers, for example, using my example from earlier, what happens when you're not in that peer group anymore and you're out, like, speaking of high school, for example, so you're not in your peer group anymore, you're out in the real world, as people call it. What happens, right? Then who do you become? Because if you've built it on the people that you hang out in high school, well, it's rare to keep those friendships for life. I know
Yeah.
maybe one person still from high school, and I haven't talked to them in 10 years. So, I mean, if I ran into her, we'd probably do catch up, but still, and it's interesting that we build our identity upon some people, and then when they're gone, what happens, right? We have no idea who we are anymore. when those things get stripped away, if we're in that too long, because
Mhm.
we've replaced our identity with these other things. And that's a dangerous place to be when you don't know who you are anymore. Cause I've like, that's when people go on these, you know, missions to find themselves because they have no clue who they are anymore. And it happens
Mhm.
with moms too, right? You know, you have kids and then all of a sudden it's all about being mom and you
Mhm.
lose sight of who you are in the midst of being mom because you have to be all things to all people in your home, right?
Mhm.
And it becomes difficult to hold on to those things that make you you, especially if, like you were saying earlier, if you are falling into the trap of the enemy places for us, you know, or we get distracted by all these other things and start forming our identity on these out external influences, then we lose sight of who we truly are at our core.
Yeah. And I recognize, one of the most vulnerable times in our life, I would say, is our teen years and our young adult years, right? That's
Mhm,
when, so many formative things are happening in our life. And if we're basing our identity on the wrong things, it will actually create in us a wrong foundation, something that we'll build upon as we grow older, but it's not based on any truth. It's not based
mhm,
on anything solid, and when something happens, when like you said, life circumstances change, friendships change, maybe jobs change, even the example that you shared about moms, like if you base your identity on what you do, what happens when you no longer have that role? You've completely lost your identity, right? And it's important that we understand where true identity comes from. It doesn't come from what people say about us. It doesn't come from culture. It doesn't come from what we do or what we can perform or what we do. It comes from within. It comes from who we are and who we were created to be. But in order for us to get to that part of the conversation, we have to explore, well, what is it that we truly believe about ourselves?
mhm,
What is the foundation that our identity is built upon? And I think these are important questions that we need to sit and be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves, what is my perception of identity? In general, but also what do I see my identity as? Like, what do I identify with? And like the questions that I brought up right at the beginning, like, who are you? Who am I? What what have I have allowed to define me? Right? Even in my, you know, middle-aged life right now, I am still finding out things that I'm like, "Oh, wow, that's a really bad, you know, perception of myself." And I can trace it back to my teen years. And because I have journeyed with this for some time, I can recognize it for what it is. And I'm like, you know what? I can't identify with that. Like, that's not who I am. And, but that comes with time. That comes with, building a strong sense of identity so that I can actually recognize when I'm stepping into the false,
mhm.
right? When I'm picking something up that isn't who I truly am.
And part of that is making sure that you fix your foundation if it's been built on the wrong stuff. Like you can rebuild your foundation. You can
Yeah.
fix those cracks and those things and make sure it's built in the right place. But I think we're going to be talking more about that next time.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else that you want to say to those that might be listening today that might be struggling with identity?
Yeah. I just want to say that if you are in a place where you feel like you've been identifying with these external things and you are wondering how you can fix it, how you can change it, how you can move forward, um, don't lose hope because you're not the only one in that space. And the truth is, even if you don't believe in God, I believe He is the way to fix those things, to find out who you are, because He's the one who created us. And he's the one who formed us and knows us inside and out, and we'll talk more about that next time. But know that there is truth found in him of who you truly are, and you don't have to buy into these external influences that you've been buying into for so long. And I'm speaking from personal experience because I've been there, you know. I lived a huge portion of my life living with external influences telling me who I was, you know, and oh, like now that I have my identity based in Christ and who he is, I find that I'm more confident, I'm more solid. If I'm shifted into a different group of people or in a different place, I'm okay. You know, I'm not like I'm not in that place of panic, not knowing who I am anymore, because I know who I am. And that's important.
Mhm. Yeah, when we have a lack of sense of identity, I just want to close with these two thoughts that I feel like when our foundation isn't right and that we base our identity on things that are false, things that are from external influences, it really opens us up to a lot of confusion, because we can be getting different messages from many different directions. And even the motives in the people that are saying these things about us or speaking these things over us can be like out of a wrong heart and all sorts of different things, but it can cause so much confusion. And I believe it also can create insecurity, right? Where
Mhm.
because we don't have a sense of identity, we become insecure, and it's almost like we absorb any messaging that comes, whether it's good, negative, positive, whatever comes our way, we just absorb it because we don't have that strong sense of identity. And so, if you're listening to this, you know, honestly take some time and think about this. What has influenced your sense of identity? What have you allowed to define who you are today? And, who are you? Those are, and maybe you're going to, as you answer those questions, maybe you're going to find some things that are based on truth, which are great. Keep those, grow those, nourish those. But I believe that you're going to find some things, some fundamental beliefs that you have about your identity and who you are that are not based on truth, that are based on a false perception. They're based on, the influences that you've had that come from external things. And it's time to look at those things so that you can, like Connie said, rebuild that foundation and then be able to build from a place of, a solid, healthy sense of who you are. And so we welcome you to join us next time as we continue the conversation um, about what true identity looks like and how do we gain that true identity in our life and allow it to be something that propels us into purpose. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on the Nosa Unleashed podcast.